The silence in the car was a living thing, a heavy blanket that smothered any hope I had left. Outside, the world was a blur of gray buildings and weeping April skies, a perfect mirror for the storm inside my heart. In the rearview mirror, I could see my son, Oliver, his small face pale and his eyes, usually so full of light, were wide and confused. He was strapped into his car seat, clutching the worn teddy bear my husband Daniel had given him on his 3rd birthday. It felt like a lifetime ago, not just a year. A lifetime before the man I loved had been stolen from me, leaving behind a void that his mother, Helen, was now trying to fill with poison. He needs a firm hand, Sophie, not just feelings. That's what she had said to me last night, her voice dripping with the condescending pity she had perfected over the years. We were in the kitchen of the home I had shared with Daniel, the air thick with the smell of the lemon chicken I had cooked and she had refused to eat. A boy needs a proper upbringing, especially now. I can give him that. I'll raise him the right way. Her words echoed in my mind, each one a sharp stone pelting my already bruised spirit. The right way. As if my way, the way of bedtime stories, gentle reassurances, and endless patience, was fundamentally wrong. As if the love I poured into my son every single day was an insufficient currency. Daniel had always been the buffer between us, a gentle mediator who understood his mother's abrasive nature, but always defended my softer one. "You're the heart of this family, Soph," he used to say, kissing my forehead. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." But Daniel was gone, his laughter and warmth now just a painful memory, and Helen saw her chance. She saw a grieving widow, a single mother she deemed too weak, and she began her campaign. It started subtly. A comment here, a suggestion there. "Oliver shouldn't be crying so much, it's not manly. Are you sure that's a healthy dinner for him? You look tired, Sophie. Perhaps I should take Oliver for the weekend. Give you a break." The offers sounded like kindness, but they were traps. Each time I agreed, she would return him to me with a new unsettling behavior. He would refuse the food he once loved, or repeat a harsh phrase I knew he had learned from her. She was slowly, methodically, trying to erase me from my own son's life, painting me as an incompetent, fragile mess who couldn't cope. The breaking point had been the legal documents. They arrived by courier, a thick, intimidating manila envelope that felt like a bomb in my hands. Inside, nested in cold, formal language, was a petition for guardianship. Helen was trying to take my son. Her petition was a work of fiction, a cruel tapestry woven from half-truths and outright lies. It painted a picture of me as a volatile, grieving woman incapable of providing a stable home. She cited every tear I'd shed, every moment of vulnerability I had shown, as proof of my unfitness. She even twisted the story of Daniel's death, a sudden, tragic car accident, to suggest my grief was an ongoing mental breakdown that endangered Oliver. I called her, my hand shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. "How could you, Helen?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Her voice was chillingly calm. "I'm doing what's best for my grandson," she said, as if discussing the weather. "Daniel would have wanted him to be raised properly. He needs structure and discipline, not just your emotional displays." That's when the fight truly ignited within me. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was a primal rage. How dare she use Daniel's memory against me? How dare she try to sever the most precious bond in my life? My emotional displays, as she called them, were love. My tears were for the husband I'd lost, and the father my son would never know. My vulnerability was human. It was not a weakness. So I hired a lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Mrs. Davies, who looked at me with understanding eyes as I recounted the story, my voice breaking but my resolve hardening with every word. She read through Helen's petition, her expression grim. "She's trying to paint you as unstable," Mrs. Davies said, her fingers tapping on the stack of papers. "Our job is to show the court who you really are. A loving, capable mother who is grieving, yes, but is in no way unfit." The day of the hearing arrived like a sentence. The courthouse was an imposing, sterile building that smelled of old paper and anxiety. Helen was already there, dressed in a severe navy blue suit, her face a mask of solemn concern. She sat on the opposite bench, a silent, unmovable mountain of judgment. She refused to meet my eyes. And then the bailiff called us in, and my heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a drumbeat of fear. "It's okay, Mommy," a small voice whispered. I looked down. Oliver, holding my hand, looked up at me with Daniel's eyes. "It's okay." And in that moment, I knew I had to fight for him with everything I had. The courtroom felt like a vacuum, sucking all the air from my lungs. It was smaller than I'd imagined, all polished wood and somber flags, which somehow made the experience more intensely personal and terrifying. The judge, a man named Judge Albright, sat elevated before us, his face etched with a kind of weary patience. He looked at the documents, then at Helen, then at me. I tried to offer a small, respectful smile, but my lips trembled. Oliver was taken to a small, supervised playroom down the hall, a mercy for which I was profoundly grateful. I didn't want him to hear the terrible things I knew were about to be said. Helen's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Peterson, began. He spoke in a smooth, confident tone that made my skin crawl. He painted Helen as a saint, a concerned grandmother stepping in to save her only grandson from a chaotic and emotionally volatile environment. He presented his evidence with a flourish. There were photographs taken discreetly. One showed me in the park with Oliver, my face buried in my hands. He didn't mention that it was the anniversary of the day I met Daniel, and a wave of grief had momentarily overwhelmed me. Oliver had patted my back and said, "Sad for Daddy?" And I had hugged him and said yes, but that we were okay. The picture showed only the moment of pain, frozen and decontextualized. Another piece of evidence was a written statement from a neighbor, a woman Helen had recently befriended. It spoke of hearing frequent crying from my apartment. It failed to mention that Oliver and I had been watching The Lion King and had both teared up when Mufasa died. Every memory, every private moment of my grief was being twisted into a weapon and used against me. Mr. Peterson described me as listless and unpredictable, unable to maintain a consistent routine for my son. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, turning to Helen, who sat with a practiced look of sorrow, "can you describe your concerns for your grandson's welfare?" Helen dabbed a dry eye with a handkerchief. "I'm just so worried," she began, her voice quivering with false emotion. "Sophie is a dear girl, but she's not coping. Since he passed, she's been a wreck. The house is sometimes untidy. Oliver has mentioned they have picnics on the floor for dinner. A boy needs structure. He needs a proper meal at a table. I am simply offering that stability. I am offering the upbringing my son Daniel would have wanted for his boy." My blood ran cold. The picnics were our special nights, a way to find a little joy in the wreckage of our lives. We'd lay a blanket in the living room, eat sandwiches, and pretend we were somewhere magical. It was one of the few things that made Oliver laugh like he used to, and she had twisted it into a sign of my failure. I gripped my hands together in my lap, my knuckles white. I could feel Mrs. Davies's hand gently touch my arm, a silent reminder to stay calm, to let her handle it. "And is it true, Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Peterson continued, "that Mrs. Sophie Sterling has, on multiple occasions, left the child in your care, stating she couldn't handle it?" "Many times," Helen confirmed, shaking her head sadly. "She'll call me, crying, saying she needs a break. Of course, I always take him. He's my grandson. I would do anything for him." The lie was so audacious it almost took my breath away. I had asked for her help, yes, but it was she who had offered, who had insisted, and I had never, not once, said I couldn't handle it. I had said I was tired. I had said I needed an hour to go to the grocery store alone. The distortion was masterful in its cruelty. Then it was Mrs. Davies's turn. She stood up, calm and composed, a stark contrast to Mr. Peterson's oily performance. She approached Helen with a polite, almost gentle demeanor. "Mrs. Sterling," she began, "you state that you want to provide structure for Oliver. Could you describe the right way to raise a child, as you've mentioned to my client?" Helen seemed to preen, pleased with the question. "Children need discipline. They need to understand rules. There should be a set bedtime, no emotional outbursts, and a respect for their elders. My Daniel was raised that way, and he grew into a fine man. A fine man who married my client," Mrs. Davies noted softly. "A woman you now describe as emotionally volatile. Did your son make a poor choice in a life partner?" Mr. Peterson shot to his feet. "Objection, relevance, withdrawn," Mrs. Davies said smoothly, before he could even finish. She had made her point. She then turned her attention back to Helen. "You mentioned that Sophie often left Oliver with you. Did you ever offer to help? Did you ever, for instance, call her and say, 'Sophie, you sound tired. Why don't I take Oliver for a few hours?'" Helen hesitated. I may have. I was only trying to be supportive." "So my client wasn't always abandoning her child on your doorstep, as Mr. Peterson implied," Mrs. Davies pressed. "Sometimes you actively sought to take him?" "I was concerned," Helen snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. Concerned enough to hire a private investigator to take photos of a grieving widow in a public park? Mrs. Davies asked, her voice still quiet, but now laced with steel. Concerned enough to twist a movie night into a sign of neglect? Tell me, Mrs. Sterling, in your expert opinion on the right way to raise a child, does that right way involve spying and lies? The air in the room crackled with tension. Helen stared at Mrs. Davies, her mask of gentle concern finally slipping to reveal the raw, vindictive anger beneath. She was cornered, and for the first time that day, a tiny flicker of hope ignited within me. Helen's face, for a fleeting moment, was a mask of pure fury. The carefully constructed image of the benevolent, worried grandmother shattered, and in its place was a woman scorned. Her lips thinned into a hard line. "I did what I had to do," she spat, her voice low and venomous. "For my grandson." "By deceiving his mother?" Mrs. Davies countered, letting the question hang in the charged air. She then turned and walked back to our table. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Judge Albright made a note on his pad, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Peterson, do you have any redirect?" Mr. Peterson, looking slightly flustered by the turn of events, stood up. "Just one, Your Honor." He turned to Helen with a soft, leading question. "Mrs. Sterling, regardless of the methods, was your every action motivated solely by love for your grandson, Oliver?" "Yes," Helen said, her composure returning as she latched onto the lifeline he'd thrown her. "Everything I've done is because I love him." It was my turn next. As I walked towards the witness stand, my legs felt like they were made of lead. This was it. This was my chance to speak, not just for myself, but for Oliver, and for the memory of the life I had built with Daniel. I sat down and smoothed my simple black dress over my knees, my hands trembling. I looked at Mrs. Davies, who gave me an encouraging nod. Then I looked at Judge Albright, whose eyes seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 similar stories. Mrs. Davies began gently. "Mrs. Sterling, Sophie, could you please tell the court what your life has been like since your husband passed away?" I took a deep breath, the air shuddering as it entered my lungs. "It's been empty," I began, my voice barely a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again, forcing myself to speak up. "It's been the hardest thing I have ever had to face. Daniel wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend, and he was the most wonderful father. Losing him felt like the sun went out. And I know it's been just as hard, if not harder, for our son, Oliver. Helen Sterling, your mother-in-law, has testified that your home is chaotic and that you are emotionally unstable. How do you respond to that?" I had to be honest. "My home is not chaotic," I said firmly, "but it is a house of grief. Yes, I have cried. I have cried in front of my son. I believe it's important for him to know that it's okay to have feelings, that it's okay to be sad when you lose someone you love. I don't want him to think he has to hide his heart. My husband, Daniel, was the most emotionally open man I knew. He would never have wanted his son to be taught that crying is unmanly." I glanced at Helen, who stared stonily ahead. "And the picnics on the floor?" Mrs. Davies asked, a faint smile on her lips. I couldn't help but smile back, a real, if fragile, smile. Oliver was having a hard time after Daniel died. He was quiet. He didn't want to eat at the big dining table. He said it felt too empty. So one night, I laid out a blanket and said, "Guess what? We're on a secret mission to the land of sandwiches." His face lit up for the first time in weeks. So we kept doing it. It became our thing. It's not because I'm too listless to cook. It's because I'm trying, in any way I can, to bring joy back into my son's life. It's because I'm listening to what he needs, not what I think he should need. Mrs. Davies then walked me through the last year. We talked about Oliver's school, his friends, his doctor's appointments, all of which I had managed. We talked about the bedtime stories, the scraped knees I had bandaged, the nightmares I had soothed. A picture began to emerge, not of a fragile, incompetent woman, but of a mother. A mother who was heartbroken, yes, but who got up every single day and put her child first. "Sophie," Mrs. Davies said, her voice soft again, "why do you believe you are the right person to raise Oliver?" I looked directly at Judge Albright, wanting him to see the truth in my eyes, not just hear the words. "Because I am his mother," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "And because I loved his father. I am all he has left of the home we built." Helen talks about the right way to raise a child, a way with structure and rules. And I agree. Children need those things. But they need love more. They need to know they are safe, not just physically, but emotionally. They need to be able to fall apart and know their parent will be there to help them put the pieces back together. Helen sees my tears and calls them weakness. I call them love. She sees a picnic on the floor and calls it chaos. I call it survival. I am not perfect. I am grieving. But I am a good mother. And Daniel knew that. He trusted me with our son. That is a trust I will honor for the rest of my life. I was crying by the end, silent tears streaming down my face. I didn't wipe them away. I let the judge see them. I let him see that my emotion was not a liability. It was the very source of my strength. The courtroom was silent, the only sound my own quiet breathing. I had said everything I needed to say. Mr. Peterson rose for his cross-examination, a thin, predatory smile on his face. He saw my tears not as a sign of love, but as an opening, a weakness to be exploited. Mrs. Sterling, he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, it is clear you are very emotional. No one can blame you for that. But do you truly believe that a child, a young boy who has just lost his father, benefits from being constantly exposed to such intense sorrow? I took a moment, dabbing my eyes with a tissue, not out of shame, but to clear my vision. I believe my son benefits from honesty, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. My sorrow is not intense in the way you imply. It is a part of me, just as my love for my son is a part of me. I do not constantly expose him to it, but I also do not hide it. I teach him that sadness is a normal human emotion, not something to be feared or ashamed of. I think that makes him stronger, not weaker. Stronger? Mr. Peterson scoffed lightly. Your mother-in-law testified that he has become more withdrawn and prone to crying since his father's death. Does that sound like a child who is getting stronger? That sounds like a child who is grieving his father, I retorted, a spark of anger cutting through my fear. He lost his hero. Of course he is sad. My job is not to magically erase his sadness because that is impossible. My job is to sit with him in it, to hold his hand and to let him know he is not alone, to help him navigate it. What my mother-in-law sees as a problem, I see as a process. He paced before me like a wolf circling its prey. Let's talk about stability, Mrs. Sterling. Is it true that 2 months ago you forgot to pay your electricity bill and the power was shut off for several hours? My stomach dropped. He had dug deep. I remembered that day vividly. It was Daniel's birthday. I had been so lost in a fog of memory and grief that the bill, which was paid automatically from an account that was running low, had slipped my mind completely. Yes, I admitted quietly. It was an oversight. A mistake. The power was back on within 3 hours. I paid it the moment I realized. An oversight, he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. With a 4-year-old child in the house. What if it had been winter, Mrs. Sterling? What if the heat had gone off? Is that the kind of stable environment a child needs? It was a mistake, I repeated, looking directly at the judge. A single mistake made by a grieving person who is doing her absolute best. I am not a machine. I am a human being. And I fixed it. I immediately set up a new payment system to ensure it would never happen again. What I did not do, I added, my gaze shifting to Helen, was use it as an opportunity to hurt someone. Mr. Peterson seemed to sense he was losing his grip. He changed tactics, his voice softening again. Your mother-in-law only wants to help, doesn't she? She has a large, stable home. She is financially secure. She has raised a son successfully before. Why not accept her help? Why not let her provide Oliver with the things you are struggling to? This was the heart of it, the question that accused me of selfishness, of putting my own pride before my son's welfare. Because what she is offering is not help, I said, my voice ringing with clarity. It is a replacement. She does not want to support me in raising my son. She wants to remove me from the equation. She has lied, she has spied, and she has manipulated my child's emotions to get what she wants. A stable home is not just about paid bills and a tidy kitchen, Mr. Peterson. It is about love. It is about emotional safety. It is about a child knowing without a doubt that he is cherished for who he is, not for who someone wants him to be. My mother-in-law does not offer that. I do. I finished, my chest heaving. There was nothing more to say. I had laid my heart bare. Mrs. Davies stood. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Albright nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on me for a long moment before he gestured for me to return to my seat. After Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Davies gave their brief, impassioned closing arguments, one painting a picture of chaos and instability, the other of love and resilience, a heavy silence descended upon the courtroom. The judge cleared his throat. He looked from Helen's rigid form to my trembling one. He read over his notes one last time, his brow furrowed in concentration. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a tiny hammer against my anvil of a heart. "I have listened to the testimony from both parties," Judge Albright said finally, his voice calm and authoritative. "I have read the submitted documents and affidavits. It is clear that this is a family in a great deal of pain." He paused, and my entire world seemed to shrink to the space between his words. "Both of you," he said, looking at Helen and then at me, "clearly love this child. However, your approaches to that love are fundamentally different. Mrs. Helen Sterling offers a world of rigid structure, while Mrs. Sophie Sterling offers a world of emotional support." He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "There is one voice we have not yet heard from in a meaningful way, and in a case like this, it is perhaps the most important voice of all." My heart stopped. What did he mean? Judge Albright looked towards the bailiff. "Would you please bring Oliver Sterling into the chamber? I would like to ask him a few questions." Alone. A gasp escaped Helen's lips. Her lawyer immediately stood up. "Your Honor, with all due respect, he is only 4 years old. You cannot possibly expect him to—" The judge held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "I have been doing this for a very long time, Mr. Peterson. I know how to speak to a child. I will not ask him to choose. I simply want to get a sense of his world." He then looked at me, his eyes softening just a fraction. "And then I will ask for one person to join us. Only one." The wait was agonizing. My world had shrunk to the heavy oak door of the judge's chambers, behind which my son's future, and mine, was being decided. Helen, across the aisle, looked smugly confident, certain her rigid authority would have won the day. Finally, the door opened. The bailiff's voice echoed in the tense silence. "Judge Albright has asked for Mrs. Sophie Sterling to join him. Only Mrs. Sophie Sterling." A gasp escaped my lips. Across the aisle, Helen's face went white, her mask of certainty crumbling into disbelief and then rage. Trembling, I walked into the judge's chambers. There was Oliver, curled on a small sofa, who immediately ran into my arms. "Mommy, Oliver was just telling me about your picnics," Judge Albright said gently, "and about the sad-for-daddy times. He said, Mommy cries sometimes, but then we build the best blanket fort and hide from the sad monsters together." Tears streamed down my face. My sweet boy understood everything. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge continued, "stability isn't a perfect house or a rigid set of rules. It is a rock. It's a person who is predictable in their love, a person who will build a fort against the monsters, even when they are fighting monsters of their own. Your son feels safe with you. That is the only stability that truly matters." Back in the courtroom with Oliver on my lap, I listened as the judge delivered his final, unequivocal ruling. "It is this court's decision that it is in the absolute best interest of the child to remain in the sole legal and physical custody of his mother, Mrs. Sophie Sterling. Your petition for guardianship," he said, looking directly at Helen, "is denied. Any visitation will be at the sole discretion of Mrs. Sterling." The gavel fell, sealing our freedom. As we walked out of the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds. I held my son's hand. The heavy weight of fear finally lifted from my chest. We were going home. Together.